Thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. A Glimpse of the Kingdom can remain free because of generous donors like you. If you'd like to donate, feel free to do so online, or you can send payments through Facebook Messenger. Don't forget to tell your friends about it so that they can enjoy this ministry as well. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any podcasts.
You can listen to my daddy every single day, like in the gym, in the car, or just at home. Glimpse of the Kingdom is awesome!
Hello, and thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I am David Pendergrass. I'm responding to a few questions here that I received. Here's the first one. Baptism, why is it necessary in public amongst others? Why is it necessary in public amongst others? Well, this is a short one to answer, which is, it's not necessary. Baptism is not necessary in public, but I do encourage it. I encourage people to get baptized in public for three reasons, or at least three reasons. One is because ancient Jews and Christians nearly always baptized in public. Now, that doesn't make it right, but it is a long tradition for thousands of years of Jews and Christians being baptized publicly. Now, someone might make the argument that, yeah, David, of course, they're public. That's not significant. It's just that everything was done in public in the ancient world. Well, that's possible. But that's one reason why I just think it's kind of cool to get baptized in public like our ancient spiritual ancestors. I think that's pretty cool. The other reason is because it is a celebration for the community. It encourages other Christians when people, it's supposed to, but it does. Any average person who really is a Christian, it's very exciting to see someone put their faith in Jesus. And so it encourages the people who are there. I think it's wonderful. I think churches ought to do everything they can in baptism to make it a celebration. Applause, standing ovation, do a party, birthday cake, all kinds of stuff for their spiritual birth, all kinds of stuff you can do to make it very special. The third reason is because it offers public accountability. Public accountability. It says something when you do it in public, and if you go and act a fool, if you get way off track your Christianity, it's perfectly appropriate for people in the audience to say, in gentleness and love, I was there at your baptism when you gave life, at least you said you had given your life to Jesus, and you don't seem to be doing that anymore, and how can I help? What's going on? I think those three things are very important. It's the exact same true with people getting married. These are the same three reasons why I encourage marriage to be done in public, not in a courthouse or not in someone's living room and no one was there. Does it still count? Yes, it still counts if you're married. Does it count if your baptism is in private? Of course it still counts. But it's good to be married in public because it was always done in public. It's a celebration of the community and offers public accountability. So, of course, I can get married on a deserted island. I can get baptized on a deserted island with only maybe one other person there. But if we can do it in community, I think those are three powerful reasons to do it. A corollary to this question I often ask is, David, is it okay for people to be baptized again or even more than once? And that's a really good question. And as a pastor, I get that question often, or at least the assumption of the question, because people do often ask me, will you baptize me even though I was baptized as a baby or as an infant or maybe even 5-10 years ago? There is no biblical verse that talks about exactly when and where baptism is to take place. So let me give a little context before I give you my answer, because the answer is it does depend. If you don't know this, when Jews, well, to this day to some degree, but certainly in the time of Jesus, a couple hundred years before Jesus, a couple hundred years after Jesus for sure, Jews baptized themselves in in mikvah, mikveh, the plural, but these are baptismal pools, shallow pools that you could get. Some were a little deeper, but basically that one person could. It's not like an Olympic-sized pool. They're like a big bathtub, and you would do that for ritual purity. Ritual purity is hard for a lot of modern Western people to understand. You have to think of sin as a contaminating factor. Something contaminates you. It's like a thing that builds up like a residue, but it's what we would call ritual purity. And it doesn't mean ritual purity is necessarily sinful or immoral. Rather, it's a residue that builds up on you. Like, it's not literally a residue, but it's something like it. So, for example, when a woman menstruates, she needs to stay away from people for so many weeks, and she needs to be baptized, ritual purity, or someone who's around a corpse and so forth. A lot of Christians think that every time a Jew violated one of these commandments, they're killed or they're never allowed back in community, and that's false. It just means they're ritually impure for a certain time, and that they have to perform certain functions or rituals that gets the residue off, and you have a timeout. You have like timeout almost to make sure that the residue is all off. And it depends. For example, the timeout, and by timeout I mean you can't go to the temple. The timeout for having a girl is longer than a timeout for having a boy, because you are more ritually impure if you have a baby girl. I didn't make up those rules. That's just a very ancient convention that we read in the Old Testament. Or if you're near a corpse, if you touch leather, and so forth. So being ritually impure does not mean you're a sinner. It means you've been contaminated. And the way to handle that contamination, there's almost always some form of ritual bathing. And so they did it all the time. Jews would baptize themselves whenever they needed to. Maybe not necessarily every day, but they did whenever they felt or were told they were ritually impure. And that could be several times a day if you worked around certain areas or certain Gentiles. And maybe not, it might be more infrequent if you were living a pretty ritually pure life. If you're not ritually pure, like I said, you can't go to the temple and offer your sacrifices. And so that's why the priests have to remain constantly ritually pure. A little footnote, I'm convinced, and many scholars are, that the Pharisees were people who were constantly concerned with purity. And there's been a long-standing assumption, or at least a somewhat viable option, that the word Pharisee comes from phades, which comes from a Hebrew word to be clean or set aside or different. We're not exactly sure where the word Pharisee comes from, but whatever the etymology of the word Pharisee, they clearly cared a whole lot about purity if the Gospels are any indication, and I think they are. Certainly Josephus even indicates this, and later on in a 4th century document by Epiphanius also alludes to that. So Pharisees cared a whole lot about purity, ritual purity. They wanted it seems, I think I could articulate it this way, that if I asked an average Pharisee in the 1st century in the time of Jesus, I would say, why do you do all this? Why do you care about washing the pots and pans and all these things? I think they would say, because we want to live a lifestyle such that at any moment we could go right into the temple, into the presence of God. I think in a nutshell, that's what they would say. I think it's hard to say most or all, but I mean, I think it's fair to say most of them weren't just anal retentive punks, legalistic punks who can't wait to have rule. But instead, they were people who were trying to live pure. And one of the fastest ways to make yourself impure ritually is to hang out with non-Jews, or the word they would use is ethne in Greek, or Gentiles, or goyim in Hebrew, the people. We use the word Gentile. If you hang out with a Gentile, almost certainly that Gentile has come in contact with something, food, drink, corpses, blood, something that is ritually impure. And so Pharisees were adamant, you're not supposed to eat meals with Gentiles. Even certain Jews you shouldn't hang out with and have meals with, because, of course, that makes you impure, and you're not supposed to live that way. So while the Pharisees didn't have any literal legal office in Israel and Palestine and so forth, what they did have, apparently, was office by influence. They're kind of like the purity police. They could not enforce it, but they sure could fuss a whole lot. And that's what we see in the Gospels with Jesus and the disciples. They're fussing. Your disciples aren't washing their hands. Your disciples are working on the Sabbath. Your disciples, what is wrong with you? And most New Testament scholars these days do not think the Pharisees, one more time, are just a bunch of rule-hungry legalists. But instead, they're people who are trying their best to get Israel to be pure. And that means you do not break the law, but also means you don't hang out and live like Gentiles. You have strong boundary markers between us and them. Okay, back to my baptism. Baptism was one of the ways you stayed Jewish and stayed ritually pure. That's the main kind of baptism that occurred in Israel. Now, we know this both from literary evidence, but also from archaeological evidence. Mikveh pools, baptism pools, are all over the place, particularly in wealthy homes like the homes of priests who worked in Jerusalem. There were public baptismal pools near Jerusalem that have been unearthed, and you can go there today and see these these look like big fat swimming pools, kind of. Those are public to get ritually pure. But wealthy people had their own private pools in their own home. or on their own property. The second kind of baptism was more rare. Jews could baptize a Gentile when the Gentile wanted to become a Jew. And we would loosely call this a conversion baptism. This was very different because in this case, the Gentile had to live a certain way, confess perhaps a certain thing, but mainly they had to live a certain way, which was to be Jewish. They had to get, if they're a male, they had to get circumcised, they had to start obeying ritual, Levitical codes of eating called kashrut. You don't eat pork and this and that. And of course, you celebrated Jewish holy days. So the seasons and the times, as they would call it, must be observed. The series of the moons, because the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, it's a moon calendar. So you change your lifestyle, and that says you're going all in. And circumcision is the way to really know you're going all in. I can imagine how painful that was for an adult with very little medication. I can't fathom how much that hurt. That probably explains a lot of times why Gentiles didn't go all in. There was one group of Gentiles called God-fearers, is the English translation. These were Gentiles who liked a lot of Jewish stuff, but they wouldn't go all in. Join the family, you might say. Anyway, if a Gentile wanted to go all in the family, what they did was those things I just said, and they got baptized by a Jew. One time. It was a conversion baptism. And it was somewhat for ritual purity, but also was probably of saying, this is now a symbol of you leaving your old lifestyle of paganism to now your new lifestyle of Judaism. The earliest Jewish Christians, the Jews who believed Jesus was the Messiah, raised from the dead, and so forth, they did what they had always done, which is you get baptized. But here's the difference. As far as we can tell, no Jewish Christian ever did ritual baths anymore. Ritual purity is associated, again, primarily with the temple. And it's striking that the baptism in the first century, and second, third, is never spoken of. I don't know of it anywhere. If it is, let me know. I can't find anywhere in the literature where anybody is baptized for ritual reasons. Now, of course, that's significant, and that's because Jesus is considered to have surpassed the authority of the temple, so there's no reason to be ritually pure. Secondly, there seems to have been some heavy emphasis in theology. We read this in text, particularly from Paul, where the Holy Spirit is now inside you all the time. So in that sense, there's a degree to which you can't be ritually impure because the Spirit makes you pure, holy. Remember, Paul says to the Corinthians, some guys were having sex with prostitutes, which was fairly common in the ancient world, and he says, how in the world can you do that? How can the holy join with the profane? Don't you know your bodies are a temple of the living God? They're the temple of the Lord. Most people use that for weight loss, but that's not the point at all. It's for purity. You are a temple, meaning the Holy Spirit's inside you. Another quick little footnote, I'm going to go back to baptism. So many churches, I dare say most I've ever been in, ever, besides my own now, or when I'm the pastor and I can have some major influence, is they have constant Old Testament theology, or we might call Old Testament pneumatology. That is the role of the Spirit. Many, many praise songs talk about that. The Spirit come down here, Spirit fill this place. That would have been very powerful lyrics if I lived in the time of Jesus. If I was speaking of the Spirit can come and go in the temple grounds. That is bad Christian theology. The Spirit dwells within Christians, not a house, not a building, not a chair, a desk, not in food. It's in He is in people. So it's a silly question to say, please come down and dwell inside of us. That's only if everybody you're listening is a bunch of pagans. If they're non-Christians. If they're Christians, that's a dumb question. That's like my son looking me in the eyes and saying, Dad, I want you to be with me. I would say, son, you're looking at me. I am with you. It's a tautology. So you don't need to beg the Spirit to come on down. That's Old Testament theology. We are the Spirit of the living God lives in you if you are a Christian. Okay. So the Jews who became Christians stopped ritual baptism, but they kept the other one. And that is, if a person wanted to become a Christian, they would have one baptism. And I will again call it conversion baptism. They don't call it that way. But it was that. It was an eschatological baptism. And said before, where a person was leaving Gentile paganism to go to be a Jew, now they're leaving their Gentile paganism or their former Jewish life, former Jewish understanding. Not ethnically and not all religiously, but the way they thought God was working in the world through the temple. Now both groups of people will be baptized into Jesus. And that's important to understand. So that's why it was always done publicly. To this day, right now, most people think that you get baptized because Jesus was baptized. That's actually not why at all. In the New Testament, the reason why it's articulated that Christians get baptized, if you read what Paul said in Romans 5, is that Christians are baptized because we are participating in the death and resurrection of Jesus. We are participating in the death and resurrection of Jesus. In the New Testament documents, and I don't think in the 1st and 2nd century documents later, I don't remember now if it ever said that way ever. I don't think it's ever spoken of that says, because Jesus was baptized, we are too. And it just dawned on me, I think I said Romans 5, I meant Romans 6. In Romans 6, he says, in verse 1, should we keep on sinning so that grace may abound? Absolutely not. How can you who died to sin still live in it? Or do you not know that as many as were baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Therefore we have been buried with him through baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too may live a new life. For if we have become united with him in the likeness of his death, we will certainly also be united with him in the likeness of his resurrection. We know that our old man, literally is our old self, was crucified with him so the body of sin would no longer dominate us or rule over us, so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. And he goes on for long about that. And in that context, of course, he's talking about we can't go back and act like I have a new master, or back the old master of sin. But it's in this context Paul's making this apparently not very controversial concept that the reason why a person is baptized is to participate with the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It is never modeled after Jesus. That's important. When Jesus was baptized, Jesus was not being baptized because of sin. In fact, the Gospels they try hard to say that, and like in Matthew, this is to fulfill all righteousness. That is, this is to fulfill what God wants. It's not because he repents of sin or needs forgiveness. Instead, the baptism in the Gospels for Jesus acts as a commissioning. And by that I mean, it is the act or the ritual by which Jesus is demonstrated to be God the Father's royalty, his royal son who now has a job to do. And that's why, if you read the text before, hopefully you have, but you remember at least all the synoptics, when Jesus is baptized, they say there's a voice from heaven that says, basically, you're my son with whom I'm well pleased. He's quoting from Psalm 2, and Psalm 2 is what's typically everybody understands is an enthronement tune, an enthronement song, where people would sing aloud. They're so excited because a king has been enthroned. It's almost a direct quote from Psalm 2:7, and I like the NET's translation, Psalm 2:7. The king says, I will announce Yahweh's decree. He said to me, you are my son. This very day I have become your father. I am your father. So it's kind of Darth Vader there. It doesn't mean literally the king popped out of a womb. He didn't pop out of his mama's womb and all of a sudden he was born. It's not about being born. To be born that way, and this is used in the Old Testament, other places, it's a metaphor for being, again, commissioning. Sometimes it's used for adoption. It's a way of getting an office. An office, that is to say, not literally in a building, but a position. You're commissioned to do a job, you get an office. And that's what happens in the Gospels with Jesus. So Jesus' baptism is for him and him alone. Other disciples, other human beings are not baptized so that God the Father says, you are my son in whom I'm well pleased. It's not a royalty psalm. And if you hear that voice, you need therapy, I guess, but that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because God the Father already has God the Son. It doesn't literally mean he's the daddy. It doesn't literally mean he's the son. It doesn't literally mean Jesus was birthed that day. It doesn't mean Jesus was just a normal dude and all of a sudden God the Father said, I like you, you're special. No, the point simply is that baptism acts as a ritual which is commissioning him to a new office as God the Father's anointed royal ruler. What kind of figure is known as anointed royal ruler? Well, the Messiah, the Messiah. That's all it is. When Christians become baptized into the Christian faith, when they're going from non-Christian or pagan to a Christian, they're baptized because Jesus Christ himself in his death and resurrection does something for us. So now our baptism isn't a commissioning to an office, but a way to participate in the death and resurrection of Jesus. And that's why it was always done, in public, because the church community was there to say, hey, look at there, everybody's together. It reminds me of a story. Someone years ago told me he was a missionary. He was visiting a missionary. I believe this was in Africa. And they had a baptism out in the river, the local river. And the guy was talking and said, this is incredible. Look, it looks like almost the whole town has showed up to watch this baptism. This is amazing. And the guy leans over and said, they're not here to watch them. I mean, they're not here to celebrate, something like that. And the guy says, what do you mean? He says, they're taking names. That is, they weren't Christians. They were trying to see who it was so they would be in the list of people they're going to ostracize or hurt. So being in public sure has some accountability, but it sure can be a celebration for those who are there, who are Christians. And of course, it's almost always been done in public. So baptism is important. I said all that to say, should a person be baptized again? The New Testament doesn't say what the answer would be to that question. So what I do is I surmise, based on everything I just said in the last 15 minutes, is that if a person... Oh, I forgot to say this too. Baptism, as far as we can tell, 99% of the time, clearly, in the New Testament, a person comes to the faith first. They consciously become a Christian, and to seal the deal, they get baptized. And that's at least 99% of the time, if not 100%. I'm not going to go there right now, but it is by far the dominant way it's done. Now, babies are baptized, we know early on, we know that from archaeological evidence within the close of the 1st century. And that probably started because babies died so much and so quickly. Infant mortality was extremely high. Everett Ferguson made this argument years ago in an essay back, I think he wrote in the 70s, but I read it about 20 years ago. But I remember Everett Ferguson, who's a great New Testament scholar, happens to be in the Church of Christ denomination, but he's a great, well-respected scholar. And he made the argument, too, that he thinks that practice preceded theology, that infant mortality was so high that they baptized just in case. They prayed over the baby and baptized in case that was, would help them and save them. And then later on, they developed the theology of original sin and so forth. I find that very convincing. So today, if a person says, can I be baptized again? I say, if you did not come to the faith consciously, you're too young, or you're a baby, or maybe you're a teenager, and I met one woman who'd been baptized like 4 times, and her parents kept dragging her around as a kid from place to place to place and get dunked. She goes, I never knew what it was for, never really cared. I was made to do it. Well, that counts as you did not consciously know what you're doing. If a person didn't have conscious awareness, I'm absolutely supportive of baptizing. Absolutely. Now, I know Catholics disagree with that. I know Methodists and Lutherans and others disagree with that. They think that baptism counts, it works, because of the Spirit working in the baptism. That's what Methodists and others, Protestant groups believe. Roman Catholics believe it works, the Spirit's working there, because it's in a Roman Catholic church and a priest is doing it. They even had a Latin expression, ex operandi apparendi, something like that, that says out of the one working is the work. So it works because of the one working it. It doesn't matter if you're the recipient understands what's going on. What matters is the priest who knows the ritual formula, the prayer, and the baptismal rite just correctly. That's what makes it count. So it's not about you at all. That's the farthest extreme. I completely disagree with that. I think that's completely unconvincing based on the biblical text. Roman Catholics would say, David, it doesn't really matter what the biblical text says. What matters is what church doctrine teaches, and that's what it teaches, and Mother Church is right. And we interpret the Bible through the church, not the church through the Bible. And that's where we fundamentally disagree. I think that's not how you should read the Bible. And therefore we disagree on that. But we can disagree. We do. And so if you're listening to this, that's what your tradition believes about that. But my view is that the New Testament should be the number one chief authority. And since that's, I think, the best way to interpret that and apply it today is to use that model. Well, David, what about people who did mean their faith, but then got off track? Some denominations call that backslidden. Should you baptize people who are no longer acting like Christians? Well, a little footnote there before I give my answer. That's interesting. It kind of sort of, that issue kind of reminds me of what occurred in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. Not so much the 4th, but a little bit. When Christians were persecuted and tortured, they would recant their faith. But then if they survived, later on, when it became safe to do so, they wanted to join back the church. And there was a huge uproar for a long time in the church as whether or not they can allow these people to come back once they recanted, but they recanted because they were being tortured or threatened to be tortured, imprisoned. Should they be allowed back in? And in general, the answer was over time, answer is yes, let them go back in, have grace. But it was a big, big deal to recant your faith. It should be a big deal. Well, it's kind of like that now. So if a person has basically lived like they recanted their faith, should they be allowed to get baptized again? There, I say, I'm not real sure. And what I do there is, that's happened a few times with me, But there what I do is I'll talk to the person. If a person really did consciously believe it as best as they could and rationally understood it as best they could when they were younger, and then they got off track, and now they have consciously repented as best they can and got back on track, I don't think there's need for a baptism. I think they just lived like a non-Christian for a while. I wouldn't do it again. And the reason why is because I associate baptism so much with conversion. And someone might argue, well, they converted and left the faith, and now they'd be reconverted to come back in. Maybe. I don't find that convincing. I think a person just lived like they were non-Christian, but now they've come back to the fold. They're back in the fold. That's my view. So it doesn't have to be your view. You can have a view you want to have. But my podcast, so I'll give you my answer on that one. Well, that's all for now, I guess. If you have more questions about baptisms, let me know. Otherwise, thanks for listening. I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you'll listen more. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com. There are tabs at the top that let you have access to all the podcasts I've recorded, to sermons I've done, books I've written. They're all there at davidpendergrass.com. You can also check me out on Facebook, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, and also look at my Twitter feed at glimpse the kingdom, or at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass. There's tons of ways to reach out. I hope you will. Send me your questions, send me your comments. If you'd like to support the ministries of Glimpse of the Kingdom, you can also find ways to give online on davidpendergrass.com. If you'd like for me to come and do some consulting, check out my website, davidpendergrassconsulting.com, and I'll be happy to come out and speak to your organization and help and train any way I can. God bless you. See you online.